is Praveen Dugal. I'm a retina specialist from Phoenix, and I'd like to welcome you to our finance panel, Financing Innovation, and I'd like to invite our panelists here. And this is a appropriate and exciting topic. When I was in training not so long ago, there was really no financing because there was no innovation, and that seems like it was just a few decades ago. And then we had some strategics that sort of looked into us in retina, and then we had companies that were mainly anterior segment companies that sort of stepped into retina and almost kind of stumbled by mistake. And now I think financing has matured, much like many of our companies have matured, and the whole strategy has become extremely interesting. So I'm really happy that we have a great group here, a very diverse group, and I'm sure they're open to speaking. This is not going to be one of those Robert Mueller hearings. This is going to be a open, robust, and loud discussion, I'm sure. So we have in order Emmett Cunningham, who doesn't need to be introduced, Ron Weiss, Firas Rahal, Michael Keough, and Ash Khanna. So let me, all different strategies, all different sizes of funds. So let me start with you, Emmett, and just move down from the very beginning just as an introduction. Can you introduce your fund and just your general outlook regarding retina and perhaps a little bit about your investment strategy?
Sure. So Emmett Cunningham, most of you know me as Claris Ventures. We were acquired by Blackstone and now are Blackstone Life Sciences. Over the 14 years that we've been investing, we started out doing pretty much traditional venture, so all stages, biotech, device, diagnostics, everything, and then slowly migrated to just biotech and just late stage. So now we finance late drug development, phase 3, and commercialization. Primarily, our typical investments are anywhere from $50 to $500 million.
Ron? Yeah.
My name is Ron Weiss, and I'm a managing partner along with Rob Rothman at Infocus Capital Partners. We're both ophthalmologists, but geographically separate, as I live here in Chicago, and Rob's a glaucoma specialist in New York. We are a life science venture fund headquartered in New York with a 90% mandate in ophthalmology. Although we had done several one-off deals in the past, we formed a formal venture fund a little bit over a year ago and have made 6 investments thus far. We have done or are doing diligence on over 100 opportunities, and that number continues to grow. We look at companies that have seasoned management, a unique or disruptive product, an attractive valuation, and a reasonable timeline to monetize. The timeline's very important to us because we know we're going to be evaluated on our performance, so that's key. We have an advisor board that's made up of ophthalmic thought leaders, both as practitioners and operators, as well as a world-class financial advisors. All of our advisors are also investors. We recently closed on a strategic partnership with the ophthalmic CRO Aura Clinical, where they not only made an investment in the fund, but we have the full resources of their organization. This partnership has been a remarkable increase to our diligence process. We're very involved in the retina space as it represents the largest market within ophthalmology. 3 of our 6 deals that we funded have retinal applications, and we see opportunities in device, drug, diagnostics, AI, so we'll continue to stay and play in retina.
So for us, as happy as we are that our glaucoma colleagues finally see some value in retina, you're a real retina guy. So what do you do? What's your fund? What's your
first,
investment?
I'm giving Ron a fellowship, and he's already ready. Yeah, my name is Firas Rahal. As he just said, I'm a vitreoretinal surgeon. I know a lot of the people in this room through that capacity, but I've been a partner at Excite Ventures since we founded it in 2014. We made our first investment in 2016. We've made a total of 6 investments now, all in ophthalmology. The venture firm is small. It's not just focused in ophthalmology. It's essentially only ophthalmology with some caveats. It's a group of 7 people, 3 of which make up the investment committee, 2 vitreoretinal surgeons, myself being one, 2 attorneys, and 3 professional investment people who have background and history in venture capital and biotech. And we're certainly high on retina. The 2 physicians in the group are retina doctors, but we've invested in the front of the eye and in the back of the eye. We're always doing diligence in all areas in the eye, diagnostics as well, devices, drugs. We've made investments in all of those, and we're looking at all those. Again, we tend to be very small. We wait for the big boys like Emmett to come in much later and hopefully don't dilute the heck out of us, but early stage stuff typically. But that said, it turns out that with the right partnerships, the right co-investment, which we sometimes can achieve with some of our bigger LPs, you can get into, as a small group, into later rounds. We've done that a couple of times, and with some luck. But we invest on the smaller scale, $250,000 to $500,000 for an initial investment, with an equivalent amount generally for a follow-on investment in reserve. Usually that comes to pass if the company's doing well. And we just made our first investment out of our second fund, so our 7th or 6.5, because it was a follow-on, our second fund we just started deploying capital from.
Thank you. Michael?
Great. Thanks for inviting me, Praveen and Emmett. It's great to be here. Michael Keough at Seabridge Capital, also known as CBC Group. We're 5 years old. We focus on in healthcare. We raise new fund every year, so currently at about $2 billion under management. Our recent fund we raised is about $852, but we continue to deploy at least a couple $100 million a year, so hopefully we'll have another fund for you guys next year. But our goal, obviously, 60-70% of our fund is to focus on therapeutics. We invest across different stages. We create companies. We invest in growth capital. We can do some public equities as well. But certainly we have made a strategic focus on ophthalmology as being an endpoint area for us to focus on, driven by obviously unmet medical need as well as opportunity as based on some of the showcase presentations that seem to be compelling. That being said, our main headquarters in the U.S. is in New York. We have 7 offices, Asia headquarters in Singapore. And in Asia, our investing has been one of the largest, investing in China. And we have several companies that are multi-billion dollars in IPO'd in Hong Kong Exchange. So we look across the globe and we look for innovation.
Thank you. Ash?
Yeah, hi. Ash Khanna. I'm a venture partner with Pivotal Bioventure Partners. We're a new fund. It's a $300 million therapeutics-only fund. We're agnostic as to the specific therapeutic area that we invest in, stage agnostic as well, early all the way towards funding a pivotal trial as well. Look to invest between $15 and $25 million over the life of an individual company. We have one investment in the ophthalmology space, a company called Oculus that's based in Lausanne that has a topical eye drop for back of the eye. But this is a sector that, because of the backgrounds of the principals involved at Pivotal, we look very actively at companies in the ophthalmology space. Previously, I was at SV Life Sciences, which is the founding investor in Ophtotech, as well as PanOptica. I'll give a shout out to Marty and Paul, who are out here. So very familiar with the ophthalmology space based on investments I'd made previously at SV, and we continue that theme at Pivotal. The one thing that I will mention is that we have a sister fund that is Pivotal China. That's a $200 million fund that's focused on the Chinese market. Obviously, I don't need to stress the size of the market there and the unmet need. And so they are the model that they have is actually incubating and starting companies. And one of the areas that they've started a company in is in ophthalmology. So it's a company called Arctic Vision that Praveen is involved with that investment. And so their model there is that they look for innovation that's happening outside of China and then develop and subsequently commercialize that asset focused on the Chinese market. So multiple ways in which we are looking to invest in the ophthalmology field. So
thanks, Ash. And we will talk about the OUS partnerships in detail. But it strikes me that there's a big difference in terms of the size of the funds and so forth. And Ron and Faraz, I'm wondering, with a fund of your size, which is small and nimble, I'm sure, how do you manage to invest in diseases such as neovascular macular degeneration that are so costly, right? You've got $200 million for a phase 3 trial. Do you avoid those altogether? Do you seek certain diseases that may be more orphan-type diseases? How do you manage to get yourself there, or do you avoid it?
No, we'll look at all comers at all stages. For later stage companies, perhaps because of the unique nature of our fund and the broader partners that we have within the fund, some later stage companies carve out a niche for us in order to allow us to participate. So that's been a great way for us to get involved in later stage companies, making a small investment, but still participating in something we believe in.
Yeah, we've had the same experience with a couple of later stage investments. Not that we could bring that kind of cash to bear, but being cut in with a group that might have much more cash, but maybe not the same expertise in ophthalmology. We might share diligence and work together. But your first point is excellent. Not to be avoided, these are huge, big pools to swim in, wet AMD and DME, and everybody wants in. And we're aware of the concerns for a group our size in those areas. So, and I know you're going to get to this later, but for us, we will go into those spaces, but with the idea that we're hopeful that the management team of the company might be looking towards earlier exit with a strategic partnership or an acquisition rather than going the distance where we might be overly diluted in those $100, $200 million rounds later.
Got it. And for the three of you with the larger funds, are there certain diseases that you would be more attracted to? Are there certain diseases that you avoid altogether because it may be more riskier than others?
Yeah, maybe I can take the first stab at this. So first of all, I think, we're very appreciative of the work that you guys do and do some of the heavy lifting to bring these more specialized deals to us, specifically in ophthalmology. But, I think for us, it's just about the unmet need at the end of the day. And so that's the focus as opposed to finding indications that we look for to plow a lot of capital into. So we have been opportunistic, and we're going to remain opportunistic just based on the unmet need that's out there, as opposed to the indication driving our investment decision.
And regardless of the stage of the company?
Regardless, yeah, we're very agnostic. So we got involved with Oculus when they had very preliminary early clinical data. But we've looked at a lot of other companies, many of them that were presented today as well, where we got in and looked at companies at a preclinical, 18 months to an IND stage.
Michael?
Same with us. Obviously, it's driven by the unmet medical need, the science behind it. Hopefully, there's some clinical data, give us some more comfort, and correlated to that, obviously, there'll be a function of the check size we'll put in. So in the earlier stage, we put maybe a small bet first to see how that plays out. Obviously, if there's a robust clinical data, we're willing to write bigger checks. I mean, so far, biggest check we wrote is $160 million. It's still very smaller than what Dr. Cunningham could do, but certainly, we're willing to make some bets. But that sweet spot is between $20 to $80 million on the opportunity. But we like clinical stage assets for now.
So Emmett, is it different for you with such a large fund? I mean, are you restricted to saying, look, I'm just going to de-risk myself and invest only in the larger, more mature companies and less so in the early stage companies?
Well, there's only a limited number of us at the firm. Right now it's 7, and we'll probably grow to 9 or 10, and we can't do 100 investments in each fund, so we just can't do $10 million investments, $20 million investments. Just to comment on what part of the early stage ophthalmology aside is interesting, right now it's oncology and rare and orphan diseases, and it's those disciplines for 2 reasons. It's highly competitive, so every company has oncology. Oncology is about 60% of our business. Every company has it, every company wants it. And rare and orphan diseases, high price, much lower risk to get to approval. So companies are racing after those, and they'll go in earlier and take them. In our space, we're benefiting from some pretty mature therapeutic indications like AMD and DME, where they're crowded, and the companies that are active have their own internal programs. And if they can wait, they would rather wait. They'd rather de-risk. So I think you have to have very compelling data to be approached by an acquirer or to go public early in ophthalmology. There are indications where that happened. We saw some huge acquisitions on the gene therapy side. Again, it's super targeted. It's a technology that people think is the future, and so they want to get access to the technology for not just gene replacement, but also for delivery of therapeutics like REGENXBIO is doing and others, at Virum and others. So that's at least globally how I think. Right now, I still think gene therapy is something that if you're going to do early, you should look at. And the more targeted, the more predictive the animal model is, the better to go early.
And I want to ask all of you, and this is for all of you, about, I understand the diligence of the assets, but one of the things that we don't talk about much is the management and the regulatory pathway. So let's start with the regulatory pathway. I wonder how you've seen in your investment career the regulatory pathway perhaps change, because I think it has changed quite a bit in terms of what is viable to be approved or not approved in this country and outside the U.S. For instance, approving an orphan drug outside the U.S. seems to be so much easier than in the U.S. Is that attractive to you? How do you look at the regulatory pathway when you decide whether to invest or not? This is open for any of you.
Well, at the earliest stages that we're often in, obviously the regulatory pathway is huge and concerning, and more of our concern and diligence usually revolves around whether the company and their management team's understanding of the regulatory pathway and their planning around it with regard to their timelines, and maybe selfishly more importantly, the inflection points that we might see as investors commensurate with those timelines and commensurate with those regulatory pathways. In these earliest stages, it's often a very small crew of people trying to manage the company, maybe just one or two or three, and they need sometimes consultants, and that's helpful, and it's often very helpful for us to know that they've had some pre-IND meeting with the FDA to get guidance. Ex-US, I'm not as experienced, but one point, and then I'll leave this to the others, it's a little different there. It's often the marketplace that determines the success of the product, say a therapeutic or a diagnostic, whereas here, the bar is often high to get to approval. In ex-US, it's often the commercialization, post-commercialization can still be poor, and so you have to be aware of whether or not it's really marketable, not just regulatory. Sorry.
I mean, for us, it's super critical. Obviously, the management team, as you know from the VC world, management team is the most important thing, certainly. And management team's ability to understand the regulatory landscape is huge. We certainly are not a hedge fund. We don't invest in clinical trial events and get out. We certainly believe these.
Is that almost as important as the asset itself, the management team?
Absolutely. Management team, the ability to execute. If they can't execute, there may be a change. But that being said, you have to bet on the management to understand. And the key part is the regulatory. Certainly from our perspective, we do look at outside the U.S. as well, because there's huge opportunity in the U.S., certainly, but also in Europe. As you mentioned, Praveen, it's easier sometimes to get drugs commercialized after approval in Europe. But we're also looking in Japan, we're looking in Asia, especially in China, because there's a huge untapped market opportunity. And with that perspective, we think about the trials that's been ran here, is it approvable in the other regulatory bodies, and whether that's commercially viable based upon some of the data that's driven. So we look at that capability. If it's not sitting at the management team, certainly we like to support the management team to better understand those landscapes. It's about maximizing value. Maybe it's not inherent the day you meet the company, but certainly how can we add value beyond just dollars to help local across different regulatory bodies, because as you know, disease have no borders, and drugs also should be able to go to every country, and there's a lot of regulatory hurdles. If you know it, it's a lot easier. And certainly I think understanding that from the get-go is really important in terms of our investment thesis.
Yeah, there seems to be, Emmett, kind of a balance here, right, between, and I can see this sort of evolving. It's not just that the U.S. regulatory thinking has changed. I mean, DME is a great example, right? It used to be 3-year studies, now 1-year studies, those kind of things. But also the change in terms of where do you do your phase 1 studies and possibly phase 1B studies. People look for sites outside the U.S., but do it in a way that can be approved and verified for phase 2 studies, perhaps in the U.S. and in select places. That kind of balance of doing stuff in the U.S. and outside the U.S. and making sure the regulatory pathway is such that it's open to U.S. and outside of U.S. How do you look at that when you assess a company?
Yeah, I recognize that lots of people go outside the U.S. early, especially for devices, where it's just easier to go outside the U.S. On the drug side, there's always the discussion of do you want less cost, maybe faster enrollment, but have to deal with the fact that the site sophistication just may not be the same as it is in Europe and the United States. And my own view is that I tend, if we can afford it, to stay in North America and in the EU. A question for Michael, if I may. Is it easier to get approved in Asia?
I think they do piggyback off what the FDA particular says more than the EMEA. If it's only approved in Europe, they will question. Certainly, they do give a lot of respect to the FDA here in terms of what they would think. Certainly, assuming that there has been a robust discussion with the FDA and clear guidance with that, I think it is much easier. There's certainly a lot of countries that would take U.S. approval and be able to launch, and you might have to do some post-approval studies. But most cases than not, you can. Only 2 countries in the world where you really can't enter without a separate in-country trial. That's in Japan and China. Right. But now they have so many changes in Japan, to a degree, but mostly in China, that you can get simultaneous approval if you incorporated patients in China as part of a global phase trial. So there is a lot of understanding and learning from the US FDA they'll glean from, and with that, they'll be able to launch quicker in the other Asian markets. So with that, there is a lot of reverence here, and we certainly could leverage that for other markets.
We've talked to the management team. We've got a lot to talk about, so I'm sort of making sure that I cover the bases that I want to touch here. One of the things that I really do want to talk about is biomarkers. It seems to me that we've got a pretty good biomarker in the OCT, right, as far as the anti-VEGF is concerned, and we've been sort of a little bit spoiled because we look at vision, we look at the OCT, and we can assess how a drug or device may be doing. Now with the diseases that you've mentioned, we've talked about orphan diseases, we've talked about gene therapy and so forth. We're looking at other things, not just vision, right? We're looking at the maze, we may be looking at ocular blood flow at certain points. When you assess an asset, is it all about vision for you, and how do you take into account all these other biomarkers that we have now that may not have the same validation as vision? How do you take that into account? Or is it still just about vision for you?
Well, that hasn't been clearly defined through the FDA yet, but we know that they're more open to looking at other things than endpoints of visual acuity of 3 lines. And so, especially in dry age-related macular degeneration, they're working to have other endpoints that are more sensitive to visual acuity. I don't think they have them there yet, but we're looking into opportunities that potentially could do that.
Well, if we've talked about how important the regulatory pathway is, you're right. In dry AMD, that doesn't exist as yet, right? We've seen with SPARC the maze being an approvable thing. We've seen with DR 2-step reduction being approvable, but all those things are just starting to get defined. So when you look at an asset where there's no clear regulatory pathway, how do you value that?
I think those markers are very useful in doing the diligence, particularly early on the asset itself. You have to have something, and you have to apply some scientific clinical judgment to the quality of the asset, and that's what may be available in those earliest and even mid stages. But you have to have at least a sense from the management team, the CEO or their advisors, of how that's going to translate into currently definable FDA endpoints. Even if you and I know, and Ron knows as a physician, they may not make the most sense. They may be what's
You're saying Emmett doesn't know?
Emmett does know. He knows so much I can't even start to go down that path. We'll never stop talking. They are the reality, even though we know that visual acuity may not be the best measure. Yeah. Visual field testing may not be the best measure in certain glaucoma devices and drugs. But these other proxies or surrogates, some of them are great, some of them aren't so great, actually. You look at them clinically as a clinician and go, yeah, that's not very good. I think you need something more. But if it looks good clinically, like potential, then at least if they have a plan to formulate how to translate it into those definable FDA-type endpoints, that's probably good enough for us if we believe in the test itself.
Yeah, I think that's a major issue because, at the end of the day, I think it's just serendipity that we found OCT, which happens to be a good biomarker for VEGF, at the same time. And it's just one of those real serendipitous events just happened historically. I mean, it wasn't planned. But then it's not a great biomarker for other things, right? There are other mechanisms of actions where it's not a great biomarker. And even for certain diseases like DME, there's a big disconnect. And I worry, quite honestly, about how we assess non-VEGF mechanisms of action, non-VEGF-A mechanisms of action, when we don't have a great biomarker and we don't want to be leaving good drugs on the table, whereas vision itself may not be terribly reliable in these patients. Emmett, you're going to say something good?
Yeah, we use a lot of terms that are loosely overlapping, connected, but aren't always relevant. Biomarker, surrogate, proxy, non-validated endpoint, validated endpoint. At the end of the day, what's most important is the validated endpoint that the FDA has agreed to. If you're going after an indication where there's no predicate and you have to have a negotiation, you should have that negotiation early so you know what that validated endpoint needs to be. All the other stuff is helpful when you're trying to gauge target engagement, figure out a dose response and what dose you need to take forward clinically, at drug effect, et cetera. But trying to negotiate OCT with the FDA is fruitless. They will not accept OCT because it's not correlated strongly. And they've said that. They see everybody's data, and they said, we're not going to do it. It's not correlated. So as much as physicians, we like it and think it's fantastic and equal to vision, it's not anywhere near equal to vision. And we should recognize that. So I look at all that when I'm trying to decide to invest, but I have to believe that they're going to hit a validated registration endpoint.
So if I may just add, just to emphasize one of the points that Emmett made. So for us, especially early enough, right, when we're looking at preclinical data in many instances with an uncertain regulatory path, for example, in dry AMD, one of the things that we, hang our hat on is actually looking at clinical surrogates, right? So is there a competitor that's ahead that's provided some degree of validation? Is there a genetic reason why going after that specific therapeutic, makes sense? So that's certainly something that is just as important for us going in early preclinically, in addition to some of the comments that the panel has already made.
Yeah. And what Emma said is valid in terms of validated endpoints. However, it bears to be said that the FDA, and I really do credit them, have changed and evolved over time as we learn as well. But I still go back to this, which is that there are a lot of people out here, who have mechanisms. And somebody had said earlier on, and I totally agree. You have a pathway like angiogenesis. It can't possibly be just one ligand, right? It can't. But we don't have a biomarker for all the others. We just don't, and I do worry about that. And vision is not great. I mean, as a clinician, I see patients come in, and I just use macular degeneration as an example, but there are others where day to day they may vary. And what we're really looking at in a visual acuity point of view is very artificial. I mean, we never sit in a dark tunnel with a bright light in the end. I mean, we have no way to assess real visual function. I think that is a major challenge that we have. So we've, yeah, please go ahead.
So just in my opinion, the two areas where we have the opportunity to advance most these new validated endpoints with the FDA are activities of daily living for very low vision patients like SPARC, and structural readout. So Wiley, for example, Wiley Chambers has said, I will take scotoma size in geographic atrophy because a bigger scotoma has to be worse than a smaller scotoma. But he will not take ganglion cell loss. He will not take bipolar cell loss or thinning of any layer. And I think there's a negotiation to be had there. And I would encourage the thought leaders, either in glaucoma or retina, to put their thinking together, to develop white papers where they can approach and negotiate it with Dr. Chambers for sure on the drug side and maybe even on the device side, because it makes no sense that a dead photoreceptor is absolutely bad and dead ganglion cell is fine. So
you said something that I know is not validated. There are no thought leaders in glaucoma, but that's something else.
Glaucoma guy on the panel.
I know. So we've talked about, we were just talking about validated and not validated, that's all. So we talked about investing. I want to talk to you about exiting before we finish. So just a general question. What kind of exit are you looking for, and what's the life cycle of your investment?
So for us, we're agnostic as to whether opportunity goes public or acquisition. For us, it's more about timeline to monetize and return on investment, especially for a newer fund based upon performance. Personally, in my past, I've done better returns with an IPO, but it's been a longer timeline as opposed to acquisition that's been a shorter timeline.
To be as specific as possible, 3 to 5 years would be a goal. It's what we discuss with our LPs and investors into our firm. And as such, we would favor partnership for the reasons I outlined earlier. Less dilutional effect for us, and a quicker exit makes more sense for our model.
Mike?
We're agnostic. Certainly, our fund is 10 plus years, so it's about multiple in return, not IR driven. So whatever's best for the company, and make sure if it's an M&A, it gets to the best commercial partner. So we're happy with M&A if it goes to the right partner and capital. IPO for us is necessarily not an exit, but is a financing event to really drive the R&D, as we talked about how costly it is to retinal trials in phase 3. So hopefully it's a good financing event that gets the company to an inflection point.
So when you say you're agnostic, the timeline maybe 3 years, maybe 10 years or longer?
Usually, 3 will be too short, probably. We hold 5 to 10 years optimally. We are a 5-year-old firm, so we had 6 exits, but those are still.
But you're making a firm. You're making a fund every year.
So we have to have some payback, obviously. But that being said, if there is additional 3 to 4x upside post IPO, then why sell? So.
Ash?
Yeah, it's 3 to 5 years for us, and basically we dual track. Once we have clinical data, we dual track M&A and IPO, and it keeps if you have the IPO option always on the table, it keeps the strategics honest as well. So we just tend to parallel track.
So almost every prospectus I've seen or have been aware of, they say either 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 years. It's a wide distribution with some exits before that, many more after that. So it's actually a fatter curve on the other side of that 3 to 5 or 4 to 6 years. The reason we've moved late is because we know exactly how long phase 3 is, and we get paid on approval. So either it's write-off or in 2 to 3 or at most 4 years, we've hit our milestone. Absolutely codified.
And that is for every investment that you have.
Well, that's our investment strategy. We are looking for market uncorrelated, defined exits. So we will invest to phase 3, we get regulatory approval, the company pays us a multiple of invested capital.
Got it. So in the last 10 minutes or so, there is something that I want to ask all of you, which I think is a really interesting trend that's going on now in terms of investing, which is partnerships with OUS entities, particularly entities in China, Japan, some in Korea, in exchange for licensing. So the company will get to keep the licensing privilege in the U.S. and in EU, but also is a pretty efficient way of getting access to capital. And I see this happening more and more and more. Let me just start with the smaller funds. Where do you participate in this? Where do you see this going? What are the pros? What are the cons of this? And then I'll go to the bigger funds after that.
So I agree with you. We've seen this trend happening. And for the most part, we've been okay with it because it does provide non-dilutive funding for the company. So, most companies we get involved in on the earlier stage, we like this happening. But you want to make sure that you partner with an entity that has the financial capacity, the expertise, and the resources to drive your program forward for that particular company. So that's been critical, finding that, and guiding expectations.
So those are the pros. What are the cons of that, Ron?
Expectations are not met on either side. And so, from the company standpoint, they have to do their diligence with who they're partnering. So.
For us?
We don't have a tremendous amount of experience with this, but on the con side, and we have 2 attorneys who are partners in our group with expertise in IP and other types of legal matters that relate to investment. The IP protection, as you've heard in mainstream media, would be one of the areas you'd have maybe some concern, not because of any specific location in the world, but where the jurisdiction will be and how conflicts might be negotiated and who will be the arbiter and that sort of thing. All that has to be kind of laid out, I think, more carefully, prospectively, especially if you're in the early stages and there's a lot of cash being needed from these folks. As long as the IP protection and other legal matters are prospectively delineated how they would be
and I imagine as a small company, that must be a big con, right?
That's a big con for us, potentially. It happens to be an area of expertise for us by coincidence because of the partnership that we formed. I don't think that was the purpose of why we formed it this way, but we have come across it once or twice with the Chinese. There are other countries that you mentioned, and everything has been fine, but we're a little nervous about that part of it.
So I've been on both sides of this, given our sister fund in China. And so I think the key thing for us, putting on sort of the Pivotal US hat here is that we want to be sure that the team that we license the asset to is credible. So that's one of the things that Pivotal China has done, is that they've got expats who moved back after being trained in the US and in Europe to China, because what we don't want to do for our portfolio company is if something screwy happens that impacts what we're doing, clinical data, whatever it might be. So I think, so the team is absolutely critical for us in terms of who we license it out to. And I think just the other thing that we're very mindful of, again, from the Pivotal US standpoint is, strategics are paying more and more attention to the Chinese market, and whether we'll take, some sort of a haircut in the event of an M&A happening for our US or EU-based company, because we've already licensed out Chinese rights. So just in addition to the other comments, those are just the two things that we're additionally mindful of.
And I so find that very interesting, because what you've done is to kind of close the loop, I take it, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, because you've got Pivotal US here, you've got Pivotal China, you've got a company out there, under the umbrella of Nanfeng, but you've closed the loop in terms of having access to the capital in the Far East, but also having a partner that you're very familiar with, it's you, right? So it's a nice loop to have within. Is that basically what the idea is?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the team is top notch. It's extremely credible. And so being able to make those introductions to either an existing investment or companies we're looking at, it's a lot more seamless because they speak the same language.
Michael?
So sure, as we have 7 offices in China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, as well as in the US. Same thing. I guess Pivotal just started doing this as well, but we've been doing it for some time. For our companies, I think we have several companies that are listed in Hong Kong Exchange, as an example, $2-3 billion market cap. And across our portfolio company, they've done 20 transactions in terms of partnerships. And a lot of them are clinical trial partnerships. So I'm not sure about early stage where you might be worried, but I think there's a lot of benefit if you're a clinical stage company to actually partner OUS strategy. Part of the reason is if you think about patient population, there's a really untapped patient population in OUS that could help you recruit faster, create a new validation in terms of your data point that could really accelerate. So certainly most of our companies done phase 2 or phase 3 level stage company partnerships. And part of the reason is because if you're where the US VC had, our US VC don't give the companies capital to do ex-US trial. Focus on US because that's the biggest market, maybe Europe, if that makes sense. And obviously M&A really wants to base the sale or acquisition based on a lot of the US trial. So having the OUS actually does create new value, I think, for the company, and is non-dilutive partnership capital really helps to drive maybe the additional assets you have in the pipeline to the clinic. So usually you could structure such that it be a win-win situation, but it's really helping you unlock new value, new potential in the OUS market. And we've seen a lot of our portfolio companies do a lot of these partnerships because obviously a lot of our companies that are based in Asia, especially in China, know the market. They all worked at MNCs before, big pharmas. They know how to get innovative drugs approved. So we certainly have encouraged a lot of the US companies to consider this partnership because it is a way to help you accelerate and unlock new value. And for example, one of our portfolio companies did a partnership with a NASDAQ-listed company, and this disease area in the renal space has 40% patient in China. The company is Caladitas, NASDAQ listed. It's $2 billion market cap. They did a deal with our portfolio company. It went up $300 million in value that day. They only got paid $15 million up front. So the investors are seeing this trend to be positive, partly because you're helping you unlock value in new markets. And that company, Caladitas, will do global phase 3 trial with our portfolio company to help unlock that value.
And so with all those pros, what's the biggest con? The IP issue?
I'm not afraid about IP, as you mentioned about headlines. I don't read the headlines as reality because practically the business
it's all fake
itself,
news, don't worry
right?
about it.
Yeah, it's all fake news. So I think the biggest con to me has always been the education and getting people comfortable. Certainly, I'm actually not Chinese, I'm Korean American. When I went to China for the first time in 2005, I couldn't believe I was in China. And then you get comfortable over time, you go there. But I certainly would do business in China. I think it's education, getting people comfortable, and not focus on the fake news or the macro news. And what is really important, as I said, I wear the hat of being a physician. How do we get the drugs that actually work to the patients all over the world? China is the second largest pharmaceutical market. How can you ignore that market? So it's all about being practical to day to day. Obviously, it does require education, but I think we're all business people here, so we'll make the right decision.
Emmett?
So I just want to make sure I understood the question. The pros and cons of partnering?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a long and risky and costly business, so you have to entertain partnering, and most companies need it at some point. I think for
Companies of any size, big and small?
yes,
Is it needed?
yeah. If you're doing an AMD phase 3 and each trial is $200 million, it's hard to raise that money, even with venture and the public market. So you have to start considering that, at even the big ones. And I think most of the big multinationals are fine. It's more dependent on the internal team than on the company, and it's very hard to have visibility into the competence of that team. But generally, they're very good. And so we take the best economics generally. I mean, people talk about cultural fit and all that stuff, but it's an economically driven thing. When you start talking about partnering in Europe or partnering in Asia, it's very different because many of these companies are smaller or less established or completely unknown in the case of China. And so it's as Michael said, it's an education thing. You have to get comfortable, you have to know them, you have to meet them. And even then, we really don't know the Chinese pathway. We know the words and we know what people say, but this is going to take a fund or two of Michael's to get people comfortable to giving their assets to him to let him do it in China or to Ash. It's just the way it's going to happen because you have to see that you have more to lose than to gain if you start being disingenuous or deceitful or incompetent. And so people will get comfortable. Right now, there's a little bit of hesitance. I personally think Asia is a tremendous market to look at, especially China. I've been frustrated with Japan and the Japanese strategics. They look and look and look, and they don't do deals. I think Europe would like to do deals, but many of these are boutique small companies, and it's hard for them to do big deals.
Well, I mean, I agree with you regarding China. I mean, the first time that I went there, my parents lived there for 13 years, was in 1983, and to see the change from there till now is just absolutely amazing. It's hard to ignore, and I think they'll play an enormous role in financing our innovation here as well, one way or the other. But to me, just to kind of take a step back, it's amazing to see over the last two and a half decades, we've gone from lasering the fovea and having no funding and just applying for NIH grants to having a whole strategy of funding just for retina, which really is remarkable. And thank you all, the panelists, for this great conversation. And lunch is on its way, I think. Thank you.